Light them needing disciples, we LED by Christ. Tune in, y'all, we shining so bright. C.W. Stevens, he the host with the vision. Bringing truth and light, let's complete the mission.
And that's exactly what we're here to do. Welcome to the LED Podcast, where faith meets culture and discipleship shines. I'm your host, C.W. Stevens, and it's time to get led. Every journey begins with a spark. Every disciple is called to shine. This is the LED Spotlight. All right, so what I'm going to do is the first LED Spotlight ever is going to be over myself. And what I want to do is I want to introduce you to me, for those who don't know me, because I want you to know who you're investing your time in, all right? So that you'll understand my stories, my sense of humor, why I teach the Word of God the way that I do, why I see God the way that I do. And so what I want to do was I want to share my personal history or my personal relationship as it grew with God. And so it begins on a dark, stormy night. All the clouds were, no, I'm just kidding. How it begins is a prayer on a bridge. So prayer on a bridge is simple. When I was 4 years old, my family was in chaos. My mother and my father, they were divorced at this time. And, there was several factors. And I know my dad won't mind me talking about it. But there were several factors that went into the family being the way that it was. And one of which was my dad. He was struggling with some addiction. My parents, they were at odds with each other, two people who loved each other, but couldn't get along with each other. And so we were living in a different place now. And we lived in government assisted housing at a place called Wayman Manor Apartments. We also lived in the back room of my grandmother's house, my mother, my sister, and myself. And at this point in time, a young 4-year-old boy, it was like one of those moments, like when you first start to realize you're a person, at 4 years old, you kind of have this consciousness. All of a sudden, you're like, okay, the light is on. I'm a living person, not just a toddler drooling all over the place anymore. And so you have these moments in time in your youth where you begin to develop an idea of who God is. And, my earliest ideas of who God is, it began with Looney Tunes. And you will see these people fighting against each other, these cartoon characters fighting against each other, the good against the bad against the good. And sometimes they would be handed dynamite. And when they had dynamite in their hand, they would blow up and they would either go to the good place or the bad place. The bad place had the guy who was all red and had horns. The good place had angels with wings, Sometimes they would have to make decisions in the cartoon. And they would have a angel on one side and a demon on the other side of their shoulder. But my earliest remembrance of who God is and my relationship with him and how I grew began with a prayer on a bridge. And so let me tell you exactly my story and how I think. So our church experience at this time is in one of two places. There was a Pentecostal church that we attended with my aunt. It was a blue church on 8th Street. Can't remember the name of it, but I know it's Pentecostal because when we would come in, everybody would get their shoes off. And man, when they started service, they get that bass guitar going. You could feel the thumping in your chest. And people up, they're dancing. It was Pentecostal. Then the other experience was with my grandma's church. My grandma's church, they were very, very conservative Baptists. And within this church, you had the dynamic of I remember the ladies with the gloves, the ushers, the ladies who would strong on the door, keep you from going in when they were praying. You could not chew gum in the sanctuary. You couldn't do anything because they snitch on you, right? And let your parents know that you wasn't doing right in the services. And so these were my two experiences, but I really hadn't, taken God serious until the bridge. And this bridge was at the end of 24th Street. My grandparents' house was right at the bottom of this bridge. And I remember this car that my mom's driving. It had those seatbelt buckles that were made of metal. And in the summertime, it would get so hot it'd burn your skin off. And we're riding in this vehicle. And at the time, my mom is pregnant, um, and she's expecting. My mom was this petite woman, but I could tell that there was baby coming, right? And my earliest memory of God is when I prayed on this bridge. And as we were going over this bridge, I looked into the sky, and I began to talk with God. And I remember the words that I said as I looked into the sky, and I prayed for God. I prayed to God. I was experiencing a loneliness, and I wanted some camaraderie. And so I prayed to God. I said, God, give me a little brother, right? Give me a little brother. And it was a simple prayer, Nobody was fretting over whether or not I began the right way or ended the right way. It was just, God, I want a little brother. I needed someone to connect with. Somebody who was similar to me, and God gave me a little brother, right? And I remember the joy that I felt when God answered my prayer, right? I remember the joy that I felt when God answered my prayer. I remember how seriously I took the blessing that God had given. I tried my best to be a good big brother, as well as my sister too. I remember he had a dirty diaper one time. We tried to change the diaper. He went number two. He went number two, and we just knew we could handle this. But we could not. We didn't tell. We was just like, we're just gonna help and do our part. And man, we got stuff everywhere. And then we tried to bathe him, and made even more of a mess. And so, don't trust little kids around babies. But we taught him a lot of things. I taught him how to play with action figures, and how my action figures were always stronger than his action figures. And as an adult, this moment, it continues to um, be the starting moment in which I began to take God seriously. And to me, it reminds me of Hannah. Hannah, the mother of Samuel in the Bible. She was in deep need of something. She was barren. She couldn't have children. She was being criticized for her inability to have kids. And all of a sudden, she begins to pray a silent prayer, much like I did on that bridge. And as it would happen, her son's name is the same name as my brother, which is Samuel. And so, as my relationship with God continued, uh, God, He changed my life in this next phase in my growth in my relationship with God. And this phase, I think I would title it, if I titled it anything, this is praying in a dark alley. Praying in a dark alley. Now, anytime I'm discipling someone, I always let them know, I'm like, hey, you need to have a testimony. You need to have a 1 minute testimony, a testimony in which you get to tell someone who doesn't know Jesus, this is who I used to be. This is how I changed, or not necessarily how I changed, but how God changed me, the process in which the change occurred. And then the final piece to the 1 minute testimony is, this is who I am now. And who I was before the change, I was a very fearful and scary person. Let me tell you, this transition takes place after my mother and father come back together. They're remarried, right? My father, he is free from his addiction. And all of this happened because of discipleship. I just want to drop this in here real quick. If you aren't discipling, if you aren't being discipled, what are you doing? Right? We're light emitting disciples, right? If you are not discipling, right, making students of other people who don't know Jesus, if you aren't being discipled, if you aren't in the position of a student, what are you doing? Like you're missing the mark. You're missing the mark. Like Jesus didn't even call us to be Christians. He called us to be disciples. Real talk, real talk. He called us to be disciples. And so who I was before my relationship continued to grow in Christ was I was a terrified child. I was scared of everything. I was scared of scary movies. My dad would let me watch scary movies. Nightmare on Elm Street, my favorite, but also still something that haunts me to this day. I still have nightmares about that movie. Freddy Krueger, I still have nightmares about it. And I remember my dad, he would ask me to go and take the trash out. And he would always ask after we ate dinner, which was nighttime. And I'm like, come on, man. We eating dinner I look over at the trash can. I know that it's full. And he's like, take the trash out. And we stayed in this house that was connected to duplexes. My aunt stayed next door. My uncle stayed next door to that. My dad's dad stayed across the street. And we lived across from a train track. But we walk out the side of the house. I'd have this black trash bag on my back, and I would walk into the alley. And all I could think about was the fact that Freddy Krueger was on the end of the alley. His arms were going to start stretching out, and he was going to start chasing me and giggling while he did it. I was fearful of that. Not only was I fearful of Freddy Krueger, I was always extra aware, extra conscious of the fact that I was going to hell. Now, let me get this straight. Let me get this straight. My minister, Brother Lewis Blair, was a great minister, but this is the 90s, and the Church of Christ is well known for fire and brimstone in the late 80s, 90s, right? You better get it right, or you're going to hell. And so I remember at this time, being in the 5th grade, I had saw many of my peers beginning to get baptized. I saw my sister get baptized. I saw the assistant minister's son. He got baptized. I saw all these people coming to Christ and being baptized for the remission of their sins. And, I'm just like, okay, I'm being inspired, right? At least I thought I was. Like, I'm being inspired. I'm like, okay, we can do it too. We can make life decisions too. And I had matured past the point of just following people. And then I remember one particular time, this is when my sister walked down. It was about maybe a couple of weeks afterwards, we're in service and they give the invitation song. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready now. And I'm sitting on the second row, the church, inside the auditorium, the sanctuary. And I tell my mom, I say, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to be baptized. And she says, no, you're not. Right. And I'm thinking within my head, I'm like, I know I am. You're wrong. I didn't say that out loud. But I'm like, I know that I'm right. I know that I know. I know that I understand what's going on, what the process of this is. I had moved past the point of when we first came into the church. When we first got there, my dad, he was discipled by this man named Kermit. We used to call him Kermit the Frog when we were little. His name is Okira Anyabwile now. But his name was Kermit at the time. This man would sit in the break room at my dad's job and just read his Bible, which is odd. My dad, coming off, of his addiction and being clean now, he listened to this man. He studied with this man. This man helped my dad come to Christ and be baptized. My dad would disciple my mom. They would disciple us, my family, my own children, my own wife. I mean, if this discipleship in a break room at Mobile Chemical doesn't happen, man, this podcast doesn't exist. I'm not even in ministry, right? If someone isn't being discipled, right? But anyway, I had grown past the point when we first came to the church. I thought that, the HBRCB, ask your Church of Christ friends what that means. And then once you ask them what that means, then go look up Walter Scott and understand the plan of salvation and how that whole process occurred. Look at your church history. Please understand your church history because the Church of Christ does have a birthday. The Church of Christ does have a birthday. But anyway, we're here at this moment. And I'm like, okay, I do understand it. I have grown past the point in which I believe that the HBRCB is how they speak in tongues, because that's when I was an early reader, and I'm like, okay, habarakaba, this is how they speak in tongues at this church, because I remember people speaking in tongues at the Blue Church on 8th Street. But we get there, and I'm not allowed to. And I'm like, okay, I'm a scary person. And now all I can think of is I'm going to go to hell, right? And I continue to pray about this, right? Because me and God, we have a good relationship, and God listens to my prayers because he gave me a little brother when I asked for it. I know that God listens. I know that God hears. And so we still have this moment in night, a moment in time to where I'm afraid at night, and I tell my dad, I'm like, Daddy, I'm scared. I'm scared. When I have to take out the trash, I don't want to take out the trash because I'm scared. My dad tells me very simply, God is with you. And he said, the way that you can overcome your fear is you can sing gospel music. I'm like, sing gospel music? Like, yeah, just sing songs about God. And so I began, whether I'm taking the trash out, whether I'm in that back bathroom where we had two bathrooms in our house. One had a bathtub, one had a toilet in it. I don't know why the house was designed like that, but it was a really old house. I think it used to be a restaurant. But I was terrified to go in that bathroom because it was all the way in the back of the house. It was dark back there, and the hallway was dark, and there was a gas water heater, and you could see the fire in the darkness. And so just terrified. And so now I got this advice from my dad and I give it a shot. I'm told to take the trash out again one night. I put the trash bag over my back. I'm walking in the alley and I'm in the alley. Now let us have a little talk with Jesus. Let us tell him all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest and he will. So I could just imagine if there's any homeless people in the alley, they're probably terrified of this little ghost kid walking down the alley singing gospel music. But I'll be honest with you, singing about God, hearing the promises about God and how he will come through, man, that gave me confidence. It gave me a confidence. And that was part of my growth and relationship with God was that in those moments and times where I'm fearful, whether I'm walking down the alley, whether I'm in that scary back bathroom, whether I'm in the bed and everybody else is going to sleep, because we all shared a bedroom. It was three of us in the bedroom, my sister, my little brother. Everybody else goes to sleep first, and then all of a sudden I'm stuck in the darkness with the monsters and then my buddy doll in the closet that looks like Chucky. Um, I'd sing or I'd hum gospel music, and I was fine. And so fast forward just a little bit, still fifth grade. It's a Thursday night in fifth grade, and we're at my grandma's house on 24th Street. And I tell my mom, I said, I'm ready now. I'm ready to be baptized. And at this point, I started to be a kid who I would take my Bible to school. I would have talks about the Bible with my history teacher, Mr. Cooper, who later turned out to be a work colleague. I actually taught at the same school in my adult life with my fifth grade teacher. But I would have these talks about God. I would have my Bible in my backpack and, 90s Church of Christ. I was up there debating everybody. I was up there debating everybody. And I was a weird fifth grader because I would have Marcus Garvey in my backpack along with my Bible. And so I'm all big and hyped up on the Back to Africa movement and also the Bible. And so chunky kid, box haircut, um, militant minded disciple of Christ, right? And so I told my mom that I was ready. She called my youth minister, who is Larry Holloman at the time, and she tells him, we're eating dinner at my grandparents' house. I told him I made up my mind, and our youth minister, he met us at the church building, uh, and I was baptized, and it was one of the happiest moments of my life. And so I went from being someone who was scary and terrified all the time to now being someone who had confidence, someone who wasn't fearful. And that change and that transformation happened after I was baptized, after I officially had a relationship with Christ, after my sins were remitted, according to Peter in Acts 2. That's part one of my story. I'll share the next part in the next episode. The light shines brightest when we see things through God's eyes. Now let's shift gears and talk about how faith meets culture. All right, so this next section is called Kingdom Culture. Every episode, I'm going to have a Kingdom Culture episode where we talk about pop culture and faith. And so basically, what we're doing here is talking about what does the Bible say about the stories that we love, about the pop culture that we take in, whether it be from superheroes to sci-fi, from the headlines to history. How does it all connect? How is it all coming together in kingdom culture? Now, this isn't one of those things where I'm like super serious about, but I am serious about it because I really think that our first topic ought to be how in the world did Disney become billionaires by stealing this gospel story? How did they become billionaires by stealing the gospel story? I really think that they just took a page out of the Bible, and I really think, as I look at it, as I see it, as I look at all the Marvel origin stories, I think that they have borrowed from the gospel story, the gospel narrative, and there's something within humanity that connects with the story that God has laid out. And the reason why the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Disney has done so well with those movies is because they have followed the gospel narrative. They've stolen it straight from the Bible without even knowing. But I really think there is a God-sized hole within all of humanity, right? We all want to connect to something greater than ourselves. We all want to see and hear stories of redemption, right? Because we all understand and we all know, whether we admit it or not, that we're fallible people. And so I want to talk about how you see this within Marvel and how they've basically just robbed the Bible blind, right? They've robbed the Bible blind. So here's what I see. Here's my breakdown of what I see in Marvel's pattern and how it correlates with the gospel story, the gospel narrative, right? There's a beginning, aka or a slash displacement part. There's a part of the story where you see brokenness and temptation. There's a third movement where we see decision to become selfless, right? Then we see where they face off against an adversary that is very, very similar to them, similar but not the same. Then we see them conquer the villain and they save the world, in some cases, the city. All right. So this beginnings phase or this displacement phase, I think, is similar to the gospel story because we have Jesus, who, according to we look at Philippians 2 and we see the Philippian hymn, Jesus leaves the majesty of heaven. Right. He condescends. He puts on human flesh, and he puts on the feelings, the emotions, the physical pain that we have because he doesn't feel that he has to hold on to it. And he comes to this earth and he becomes a human being, and he has to go through all the things that we go through, which ain't the Bible. Well, is not for the grammar police. It is not. Um, it's not heaven here, right? Now, some people may try to say that it is, but it's not. It's not heaven, right? And so we see Jesus leave the majesties of heaven. He condescends, right? Kenosis. He becomes incarnate, and he makes it down to this earth. And so what we see in the beginning of the Marvel stories is the same thing. The hero of the story, he starts in a normal or seemingly normal state, but he's soon displaced by a tragic event, right? He becomes less than. Now, here's my four examples. Peter Parker. What happens with Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man? Which my favorite Spider-Man is Tobey Maguire, by the way. The new kid, he's doing okay, but Tobey Maguire was the best one. Argue with your mama. Um, but what happens with Peter Parker is that he loses Uncle Ben. In almost every movie, that's the tragic event. That's the displacement, right? That's where he begins. He loses Uncle Ben. Iron Man, Tony Stark. He's a playboy, right? Starts off doing the wrong thing. He's kidnapped, put into a situation that is a tragic event, an accident, right? Somewhere where he can experience this revelation, right? Then we have Steve Rogers, aka Captain America. That's my favorite. That's probably my favorite movies. I haven't seen the newest one yet. I don't know how Anthony Mackie is going to handle that, but I know that it'll be better than his rendition of Tupac, right? Then we got T'Challa, right? Now T'Challa, he already was who he was, right? He's just different. Black Panther is different, but his moment of displacement is when he loses his father, right? Now let's move on to the brokenness and the temptation. The hero experiences, right, struggle. He experiences loss, trauma, or temptation to use power selfishly, right? And I think that we see this, right? I think that we see this in the gospel narrative. Jesus goes into the wilderness. Excuse me. Jesus goes into the wilderness and he experiences temptation. Like, he legit experienced temptation. Like, I think people fail to realize that, but Jesus experienced temptation. That's in the Bible, right? That's in the Bible. And so we see that. Go back to my four examples. Peter Parker. He initially uses his powers, my version of Peter Parker. He goes to this wrestling match and he's using it to get money. Somebody robs, and that's what leads to Uncle Ben dying. But he uses his powers for personal gain. Tony Stark, billionaire playboy. He's selling arms or weapons to other folks just to get money. Here's another example. Doctor Strange. He's arrogant. He refuses to change, right? Wanda, right? Wanda Maximoff. She begins to flirt with darkness while she's reading the book due to her grief. Well, Jesus didn't succumb to temptation, but I think that the reason why we connect with the Marvel movies so much is that we're fallen people, right? We have fallen. Jesus, he did it perfectly. The second Adam did it perfectly, but we have fallen. And so I think that's why we connect to it. I think that's why Disney and Marvel Cinematic Universe, that's why they made millions, because they connected with us on that level. Now, the third movement is a decision to become selfless, right? This is this moment of clarity, and it forces the hero to reject the selfish desire and to then dedicate themselves to something greater. I think this moment is akin in the gospel story to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's praying to God, if I don't have to go through this, remove this cup from me, right? So I don't have to do this thing that that I know that I'm supposed to do. And God just sends angels to minister to him, right? He's so stressed out. He's so anxious in this moment that he begins to sweat blood, right? Which I think is a real, I've seen this thing. It's called hematohydrosis. You gotta look up the spelling. But hematohydrosis, it's like when your body experiences so much anxiety that blood begins to come out of your sweat pores. And so he's going through it. He's grown through it, and he chooses the better portion, which is to remain obedient to God, even though it means that he's going to have to sacrifice himself. Well, we see the same thing in Marvel. Peter, he embraces the concept that his Uncle Ben introduced to him, and that is the famous line, with great power comes great responsibility. Right. And then Tony Stark, he's got kidnapped. He's in this underground pit and he builds the Iron Man suit. And then he swears off selling weapons. Then we have Steve Rogers, Captain America, right? He's this scrawny kid, and when he's in training before he gets the serum, right? I remember before he got all swollen and stuff, somebody had a grenade, and they throw it. This dude goes and he jumps on the grenade. He jumps on the grenade, and he's like, he's going to sacrifice himself, right? That's when they knew he was the one. Then we have Thor, right? Thor, and this is the bad Thor. I didn't like this Thor movie. The Thor, whenever you remember when Thor came to Marvel Cinematic Universe, he didn't have eyebrows. This is that Thor, but he learns humility and he sacrifices himself for others, and then that's what makes him worthy of picking up Mjolnir, right? The hammer. For those who are not Marvel savvy, only the worthy can pick it up. Now we look at the face off against an adversary who is similar to them, and this is when the villain gets a reflection of the hero, or is a reflection of the hero, and he embodies a path that they could have taken, right? And I think we see this in the gospel story with Satan. He's similar to Jesus, but he ain't Jesus, right? He's kind of like him, but he's not him, right? We see this even in Revelation. With the talk of the devil, the adversary. He's similar to Jesus, right? He can offer kind of the same things. He even offers Jesus things in the temptation narrative, but he can't do what Jesus does, right? He can't do what God does. He distorts, right, what has already been created, but he can't create on the level that God can. And so, what we see in Marvel is they often give very similar enemies to the heroes. And so in Spider-Man, you have the Green Goblin, right? And he made the wrong choice when it came to power and responsibility. Spider-Man made the right choice when it came to power and responsibility. And then you see in Iron Man, you had Ironmonger and you had Iron Man. And then you had, with them, you have, what do you do with the selfishness, right? Do you lean into selfishness or do you become selfless, right? And then one of the greatest. Now, people, especially my cousin, I was just talking to him the other day, and he was telling me how Thanos was the greatest villain ever, and I'm just like, no, sir, it's Killmonger, hands down. And that's why I think Marvel, you made a mistake by not allowing Killmonger to have lived and become the next Black Panther. That would have been the comeback story for the ages. For him to come back from being Killmonger to become the Black Panther. If they can't, man, they need to make that happen in part three. But I'm guessing since in part two they showed him in the dead place, the Hades of their world. I guess he actually is dead, but they should have brought Killmonger back because Michael B. Jordan killed that. But his thing was, Black Panther and Killmonger was, okay, do I lean into vengeance, right? Take it into my own hands, or do I lean into justice, which Black Panther leaned into justice, right? Um, but Killmonger wasn't lying. He wasn't lying. I'm not saying that it was right because we all know and understand vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, right? Then we got Red Skull and Captain America. That one was that one. If you pay attention, that really is distorted nationalism. It is. It's distorted nationalism. One made a decision to do right, one didn't. So very similar in who they are, but they make the right decision. One and the other makes the wrong decision. And then finally, in this movement, we have the hero conquers, the hero triumphs, and it's not just through strength, right? But it's through this moral growth and it's through this personal growth, right? Peter is able to defeat the goblin, but he refuses to kill him. I love that. Tony, he outsmarts Obadiah, and then he evolves further. T'Challa, he's like, dang, my daddy did some messed up stuff. But still, he's like, I'm not taking vengeance. He rejects Killmonger's ideology. And then he also offers Killmonger redemption. And I wish he would have taken it. I'm still stuck on that. Steve Rogers, he quite literally sacrifices himself over and over again for others. That's why I love the Captain America saga series. I still haven't seen the newest one, but maybe I'll go see it a little later. But that's how Disney has made billions off the gospel story. What do you think? So now we've seen how the world tells one story, but God tells another. Now let's hear from you in our next segment. You asked, now it's time for answers. This is God Questions, where we take real questions and seek real biblical truth. All right, so this is a section I want to use because we have a lot of people who come to. I mean, if you're a minister, you know this. People come to you all the time with questions, and they expect you to just know it right off the bat without any preparation, any studying. And so I want to dedicate this section for those people who want good answers and for those ministers who want to give good answers because I don't like just coming off the cuff, you know. I don't know it all, uh, but I've been blessed to have been able to attend great seminaries where they taught us how to figure out authorial intent and to learn how to study God's word in a responsible manner. I was able to attend Austin Graduate School of Theology for my bachelor's, and most recently, I was able to attend Lipscomb University where I earned my Master of Divinity. And so I I don't know it all, but I am able to find it. You know, and I tell people all the time, I don't know it all, but I will find. I will search, I will seek until I can find something that will help put your mind at ease. Now, the question that we have on deck for today is a difficult one, and it is when does submission become domination or abuse? And if a woman decides to leave, biblically, can she go? That's the question. So, in thinking about this, I started to think about the movie with Martin Lawrence and Lynn Whitfield, It's called A Thin Line Between Love and Hate. And she has this quote in the movie where she says, a man just comes along and he buys us off a shelf, then he plays with us until he thinks we're no longer fun or until he gets us all dirty, right? Then he just wants to throw us away, right? I love that line from that movie because I think that's, in my mind, I think that's where this question is coming from. It's coming from a place to where someone has been used as a plaything and thrown away. And I want you to understand. I want you to know that even though our culture has made it to where women and sometimes men are put in that situation to where they're not a spouse, but they are a plaything, that is not God's intention. Now, I had the opportunity to preach a sermon series, and I do it every year about marital roles. But I feel like during that sermon series, the text that I used this past time was in Ephesians. I feel like this is the best text to explain the dynamic and to answer the question. So Paul, he writes this letter to a church that is in Ephesus, and it's a Greek culture. It's a seaport town, and they got a little bit of everything going on. It is a gumbo of sin, polytheism, and it's hostile towards those who worship Yahweh God. In the letter, he tells them, he's like, y'all used to live this lifestyle. Y'all used to live this way, but now you have privilege because God has allowed you to become part of the family. And he says, if you want to live the way that God wants you to live and live into that dynamic, then you have to respond by living in a manner that's worthy of your calling. Paul says there's a right way to live. You can't just do it like you used to do it. There's a change that happened, and now you must change. So he's basically telling them, okay, you live in Ephesus, but you're no longer just Ephesians. Now you are heavenly citizens. And so that must reflect your identity and through your actions, right? So fast forward in this letter that he wrote to him to Ephesians 5:21, he says, this is how you do it. And I believe this is where the pericope starts. He says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. This is how you do it. You must live in submission. And this Greek word that they use there is hupotasso, which means to place oneself under the authority or the auspice of someone else. In Ephesians 5:21, that's where I think it's like the key verse of the whole book. This is how you do it. This is how you create the kingdom of God on this earth, right? Out of submission to one another. And he goes into how the relationship between husband and wife looks, how parent and child looks, how worker employee looks. And so he says this after having said that we are supposed to imitate God. And if you think about it, the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, they're able to coexist with each other using this same means. The Father doesn't infringe upon what the Son is doing. He has the plan, but the Son carries it out. The Son doesn't infringe upon what the Spirit is doing because Jesus leads and then the Spirit steps in. And what we call this, the theological term for this is called perichoresis. And it's like they're doing this humility dance where they're in submission to each other while still being able to be who they are as individual persons within the Godhead. They're able to coexist and to live in harmony with each other. So if that's the case among the Godhead, then certainly that must be the case among the church and most definitely within our Christian marriages, which are a sermon to the world that talks about the love between Jesus and the church and the relationship between Jesus and the church. Now, when he begins to address the wives in this passage, he uses three verses to talk to them. He instructs them, he says basically, wives, you are to willingly place yourself in submission to your husband, right? This hupotasso, Greek word, submit to the orders or directives of someone, place yourself willingly under someone. You're called as a wife to submit yourself to your husband in everything. Now, I'm keeping it very simple. And I know that it's complicated to do so because we got to die to self. There's some self denial in there, there's some self control in there, right? It doesn't mean that you're weak. It means that you have taken the power that you know that you have and willingly submitted to the person that you have said that you're going to spend the rest of your life with. Because, I mean, when you really think about it, if you're living in submission to a man who is also living in submission to God, then you're living in submission and obedience to God, right? Now, to the husbands, Paul, devotes 9 verses to them, 9. And he says, husbands, you ought to submit to your wives too. Remember Ephesians 5:21? But the submission that the husband engages in is different. This submission is a submission that is of self denial, a submission where one is willing, the husband has to be willing to die. Um, could be physically, but I'm thinking that it's more a self denial or a denial of self so that the wife can be sanctified and so that the wife can be elevated and made ready for God. Now, again, I know I've mentioned this already, but consider the Garden of Gethsemane and Jesus there, and he's overwhelmed to the point of sweating blood. And despite his flesh wanting to skip the part where he goes through this agonizing pain and crucifixion, his spirit, right, the other part of himself, submits to the will of the Father. Check out Matthew 26:39 for that. So similarly, husbands, we must be willing to sacrifice ourselves for the wife's well-being. What does that mean practically? That means that we have to understand, okay, the Bible has stated that she is the weaker vessel. And so there's going to be times in which you're going to have to consider that. There's going to be times in which you're going to want to have something. You're going to want to have things. You're going to want to do certain things, but you're going to have to say, okay, what is going to make my relationship better? What is going to make my wife grow closer to Christ? And if that means that you're going to have to sacrifice some part of yourself, you're going to have to be willing to do that. Because if the relationship is similar to Jesus in the church, Jesus was willing to die for us, right? Even though we didn't deserve it. And so that means that even when she's not acting like she should as a Christian wife, you still have to be a Christian husband because Jesus didn't stop being Jesus when we continued to sin and put him on the cross. So when you look at it, both parties are responsible for submitting themselves for the other person. It's not about you. When you come into a marriage, it's not about you. But unfortunately, there's been a concept that's been introduced to the world, and that is the concept of a contractual marriage, right? But the Bible has not issued us something that says that we should engage in a contractual marriage, but the Bible has stated that marriage instead is a covenant. Now, for those of us who have looked up and looked into these words, a covenant is a promise, right? In the Bible times, this word covenant, but in the Old Testament Bible, in the Old Testament ancient Near Eastern culture, when they engaged in the covenant, they would slice an animal in half and walk through the animal. It was an agreement, right? It was an agreement. It was a promise, right? A covenant. But let's talk about the characteristics of a contractual marriage. Um, in a covenant marriage, both spouses, they live in mutual submission, right? They're both submitting to each other, and they both express a self-giving love. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that you get what you need. You get what you need. It's a choice that you make every day. But what we see happen is domination and subjugation. It arises in a marriage whenever it becomes contractual. And what I mean by that is a contract is I will be a husband or a wife as long as you fill in the blank, right? As long as you do this, I'll be your husband. As long as you do this, I'll be your wife. That's a contractual marriage. But a covenant marriage says, I will submit and offer unconditional love no matter what, right? No matter what happens, I will submit and offer unconditional love. That means that the love that I express to you has no conditions attached. I don't have to cook every night for you to love me. I don't have to cut the grass on your timeline. I'm going to, or you're going to love me, right? This unconditional love, right? There's no strings attached to it. I just give this love. This is the agape love that God showed. And this is the love that we show within our marriages, or what we should show in a covenant marriage. But this is where abuse happens. Abuse begins when one spouse stops giving and starts demanding, right? And within a Christian marriage, we are led by the Spirit of God, right? Not by human hands or human demands to reflect our heavenly citizenship. We should show that we are citizens of heaven with how we behave in our marriage. Now, abuse, this is where abuse happens, right? Because if we're both giving ourselves self-sacrificially, we're both submitting to one another, rather. we're both submitting to one another out of mutual submission. Abuse occurs when a spouse deviates from their God given role, right? Whenever they stop submitting, that's when abuse happens. Now, abuse is serious. We have physical abuse, we have verbal abuse. Um, these different type of abuses happen within marriages, and it's never okay. Now, I would never tell someone to stick around and get your head beat in. If that's happening, you need to get out the way. You need to leave, right? That's never okay. You need to call the proper authorities and deal with that. But what I do see with the Word of God is that it seems as though it encourages um, working things out and reconciliation, and I think that's a thing of being a heavenly citizen, right? Now, what we do see in First Corinthians 7 is that if you have a partner who is an unbeliever and who wants to leave, let him leave. First Corinthians 7, 15, let it be so. You know, because if we're seeking to be like Jesus, I think that, and what I believe that I read in scriptures is that we're trying to be like Jesus. We're trying to become more like Jesus. And if you look at him and what he did on this earth, he did not end his submission to humanity despite our disobedience. He remained faithful. He continued to pursue salvation and redemption and reconciliation. And so, as Christians, our mission should align with Christ, and we should be about the reclaiming of both people and relationships. However, Scripture does permit divorce, but I believe that as I read it, it is a last resort, right? We see in the cases of sexual immorality where the Bible gives an allowance for divorce. And we see Matthew 5:31 through 32, Matthew 19:8, Mark 10:3 through 5. Um, and again, Paul, he addresses abuse um, when you have a believer who is married to an unbeliever. It's not necessarily talking about abuse, but it's talking about somebody who doesn't align with the will of God. Um, that there is room for separation um, in that relationship. That's allowable. But he says, though reconciliation is encouraged, right? And and if you stay, the whole point of staying is to lead the unbelieving spouse to salvation. So, in conclusion, when does submission become domination or abuse? Submission becomes abuse when the spouse stops giving and starts demanding, right? Can a woman or a man, I'm adding a man into this, can a woman or a man leave? Biblically, a spouse can leave if the covenant has been broken. They can leave in that situation, right? Through infidelity, sexual infidelity. Otherwise, he or she may separate but must remain single unless reconciliation occurs. Ultimately, I believe that God desires the redemption of relationships and the preservation of marriage as a testimony to the gospel. Great questions lead to greater faith, and faith, it grows when we practice it. Let's get to work in our final segment of this show. Discipleship isn't just what we believe, it's how we live. Welcome to Training in Righteousness, where faith meets discipline. So, for this next section, what I'll do every episode is I'll introduce a different spiritual discipline. Now, I want to let you know before we get started in this that spiritual disciplines are not at all essential for salvation. Yeah, they're not. But they are helpful in that they help us to become more like Him, right? Capital H, Him, Jesus Christ. And so, what we do with spiritual disciplines is that we take a look at the things that Jesus did while in his earthly body and we begin to practice them. Jesus would often do many different things. He would separate himself in solitude, he would pray, he would fast, he would do all kinds of things in order to kind of hone in on his relationship with the Father. And I think that spiritual disciplines, they aren't salvific issues again, but they help us to create a rhythm that will allow us to lead better Christian lives on this earth. And so the first one that I want to introduce to you today is one that I learned in seminary, and it is the palms up, palms down prayer. Now, some of you may be listening to this while you're at a gym where you're in a loud place, and so you can try this later. But if you're sitting at your office or if you're sitting at home, here's what I want you to do. I want you to find yourself somewhere to sit. Um, get in a comfortable seated position, feet flat on the ground. Sit up straight, and I want you to focus on breathing. Take a deep breath in. Take a deep breath out. Take a deep breath in. Take a deep breath out. What's going to happen is that we're going to take a posture or position to where our palms are face down. You can sit them on your thighs, your legs, or you can hold them in the air. It's harder to hold them than it is to set it down. But as you have your palms facing downward, I want you to think about all that has transpired at this point in your week, all the negativity, all of the bad that has happened, all of the wrong things that have happened, the things in which you disagree with God about, the wrong in which other people, other human beings have done to you, the pitfalls that you have fallen into, the ways in which you have sinned. Our palms are facing downward because we are letting go of those things. I'll give you a moment to think. Now, as we have thought of these things, and you could pause it if you need more time, I want you to change your hands to where they're facing upwards because now I want you to begin to talk to the Father. I want you to ask Him for what it is that you want. I want you to ask Him to give you what you need. I want you to state your petitions before Him. I want you to ask Him to help you to grow deeper and deeper in love with Him. As our palms are pointed upwards, we are now receiving what God has for us, receiving it with contentment. If you need more time, you can pause it. But it's as simple as that. That is your first spiritual discipline that you've learned, at least from this podcast and from this source. I will be introducing new ones every week. And of course, I'll go more in depth with others, but this was a simple one. This is just a prayer where we are examining what is going wrong and then asking God to fill us with His love. Faith isn't just something we talk about, it's something we train in daily. Keep growing, keep sharpening, and keep walking in the light. Thanks for tuning in to the LED podcast. If today's episode blessed you, don't forget to subscribe and send in your God questions. And remember, keep shining and stay led.
Light emitted disciples, we LED by Christ. Tune in, y'all, we shining so bright. C.W. Stevens, he the host with the vision. Bringing truth and light, let's complete the mission. Light emitting disciples, we LED.